I'll start this conversation with basically with two sort of straightforward questions. And they are, what is culturally responsive education? And when and why did it emerge? And so in order to do justice to these questions, I provided a timeline. And so basically in this timeline is basically from 1864, 1865, which is the year or circa the year in which enslavement ended, and also circa around the time of the post-Civil War period. And so 1865 to roughly 1954, 1964, because that's another watershed moment. That is when the Brown versus Board of Education decision, the Supreme Court decision, desegregated the schools in the United States. So let's start with the 1865 to 1954-64 period. And there's a 54/64 because the Brown decision, although it was initially legislated in 1954, it took about 10 years or so for the legislation to actually gain its teeth and sort of, witness the full impact of it. So it was about 10 years for that to occur. But culturally responsive school education, or culturally responsive education, is a product of the segregated school system in the United States. And what I mean by that is, from 1865 to 1954-64, give or take, you had a 100-year school system, segregated school system in the United States, meaning that there were, all Black educators, principals, school leaders, school nurses, crossing guard, right? The whole gambit. Black educators and Black students are in these nurturing environments. But we have to establish a few things before we move along this timeline. So in 1865, as enslavement ended, the literacy rate amongst Black Americans was 10%. This is according to the historian James Anderson. So 10% of Black Americans at this time could read, which makes sense, which in some cases is phenomenal in the sense that it had been illegal and against the law for Black Americans or for African Americans to learn how to read or write. Like, it was against the law, and there were punishments dealt out to those caught reading and writing or teaching the enslaved how to read and write. But nonetheless, 10% of them, upon the end of enslavement, could read and write. By 1900, that number reached 50%. And by 1930, it had reached 80%. So from 1865 to 1930, it's roughly a 65-year period or so, you had this 70% increase of literacy in African-American or Black American communities. And this is largely self-taught. They're largely self-taught. So 1930 is a watershed moment, is a pivotal time in U.S. history, really. It's not, this is U.S. history. And in the sense that you had this mass revolution of sorts of education, spilling out throughout Black communities in the United States, particularly in the South. And you had, at that time, you had 78 historically Black colleges and universities, right? 78 of them by 1930. The number would eventually balloon to about 121 historically Black colleges and universities. Today, there's about 115. But the point, 1930, 78 HBCUs in the US, primarily, mostly in the South. But also in 1930, something very, very pivotal happened in the sense that the Miseducation of the Negro was published in 1933 by the author Carter G. Woodson. And then what's not on the timeline is the 1954/64 Brown versus Board decision, but I'll go into that a little bit later. All right, because we're still on 1930, in the 1930s. And so Carter G. Woodson, who was born in 1875, he's an historian, the father of Black studies, and he's the second Black PhD from Harvard, the first being W.E.B. Du Bois. Carter G. Woodson, as the father of Black studies, did something, or or you could say led something that was significant in terms of educating Black students in the United States. And it had a ripple effect from this point in time, from the 1930s into the 1960s. And I'll unpack that. But basically, what the miseducation of the Negro, again, published in 1933, and is still a classic text right now, incredibly relevant to this day. But in that text, we see for the first time the highlighting of the impact of Eurocentric curriculum as hostile and as hostile to Black students, their psyche, and their communities. And so the ways in which he highlighted this, and the ways in which Carter G. Woodson highlighted this, uh, it caused a stir amongst Black educators. Because remember, this is a Black educational system because it's against the law for Blacks to be educated except that they're educated in segregated schools. So it caused a stir amongst Black educators. And what happened was they went on a self-determination and an empowerment crusade, right? Which led to, uh, resisting or obfuscating state-controlled imposed curricula. And at the same time, you know, figuring out ways to incorporate Black curricula that dealt with Black history and Black culture and different aspects of that would increase the humanity or restore the dignity of Black people, right? And the Black educators in the South did this despite significant resistance and significant obstacles. And so these are some of the examples of the pillars of what we call culturally responsive school education, or culturally responsive, school education today. These are the origins of what it is we are doing and what we're talking about today when we talk about culturally responsive school education. Now, the impact from 1930, we see, we see the fruits of this miseducation campaign, or this call to leave off this miseducation campaign and to teach Black students from a perspective that would make them proud of themselves. And so what we saw was, in about a 20 or 30-year period, we saw this Black pride, Black power movement in full swing by the 1960s, right? So this is the birth of Black pride. The Black is beautiful, the Black power. These were the product of counter messages that Black folks were inferior, that their history, that their culture, their ways of living and being was inferior. This 30-year campaign of education, segregated education, is highlighted by this particular period in time in the 1960s. And it fostered generations of Black activism. So in the 1960s, it's not a coincidence. It doesn't happen, by happenstance, right? That you have in this particular time, you have musically, you have artistically, you have entertainment, professional and amateur athletes, and Black politics, all espousing Black power, Black pride. It's not an accident that just 30 years, because they were primarily in school. They were the first generations. These folks would be in their 30s now, or in their 50s now, or whatever the case is, whatever the case is, they would be adults having been brought up through this shift in Black education starting with 1930. And again, we see the peaks and the fruits of it by 1960 with the civil rights movement and the civil rights leaders. So now what happens? So now what happens is um, you have the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954. 1964 was when it gained its, kind of became, came into full swing, so to speak. So that's why 54, 64, because in some instances, some school districts desegregated right away, but most of them didn't. And so, many of them did it, and it took, about 10 years for, and in some cases even longer than 1964. But that's another issue and conversation altogether. But the Brown versus Board decision, 1954-64, in what Leslie Fenwick describes in her book as Jim Crow's pink slip, which was basically the elimination, as gathered in the research and presented to us by Leslie Fenwick, the elimination of documented over 100,000 Black educators lost their job as a result of the Brown versus Board decision. There's a documented at least 100,000 Black educators, principals, and teachers who lost their job as a result of the Brown versus Board of Education decision, right? Not only that, but you have 100 years, 1865 to 1964, roughly, 100 years of aggregated, compounded leadership, teaching, pedagogy, and people lose sight of this. In many cases, if not most cases, more educated and more credentialed Black educators than their counterparts, right? Because remember, and one of the short-sighted, many short-sighted implications relative to the Jim Crow laws was that the Southern states disallowed for Black educators to go to, white historically or white universities, right? So if you're, for example, in North Carolina and you want to go to graduate school, say you're a teacher or a principal and you want to go to graduate school, right? You can't go to the graduate school anywhere in North Carolina, or this is anywhere in the South. You had to go to one of the northern institutions or the Midwestern institutions, right? Like this was this was the law. So what was happening was, and this happened all across the South, these Black educators were going to elite universities in the North and in the Midwest, getting elite education from the University of Michigan, from Iowa State, from Columbia University, from you name it. They were getting this elite education, and they were coming back into the South. And so in many cases, you saw that the education happening in the segregated Black schools was far more advanced than it was in their counterpart schools, the white schools. And this is a fact that, only relatively recently researchers have started to unpack these facts, right? So, but the 100,000 pink slips, as Leslie Fenwick called it, is the result of the Brown versus Board of Education decision. So what does that mean even further? Like I just kind of unpacked some of it, but basically what we call culturally responsive school education, it didn't necessarily have a name then, right? They didn't call it that. This is what the educators were. This is what they embodied. Their practice was embedded in who they were. So they didn't call it culturally responsive. They didn't call it these things. This was them understanding the moment, This was them understanding their past. This was them understanding that education was the ticket to a brighter and to a better future for their communities and for their children. This is and we see the fruits of that labor, of those decisions. We see it in the 1960s, right? We see it clearly by the 1960s. So, but they didn't call it what we're calling it today. They didn't need a name for it. It's what it was, right? And so again, as I started out saying, you know, the ways in which many of us talk about culturally responsive school education, it's not a theoretical construct. This is an evidence-based, reality-based, um, historical, factual, like we have data and evidence, and in many cases we have people who are still alive who can attest and provide examples of what it was they went through, either in some cases as educators and in some cases as students. And we have a lot of them on record talking about this, right? So this is very important. So again, when we talk about the 1950s and the 1960s, this is very pivotal as we start to look at where we are today, because there were the local civil rights struggle in the United States. People have to understand something. James Anderson talks about how James Anderson's book was published in 1988, and the title, it's a long title, and it's something about the education of blacks in the South from 1860 to 1935. I think that's the title of the book, but it's a historical book, and it's a lot of phenomenal information in that book. But in that book, and I always tell my students, I say, if there was one book that if I were the director of a program that every student would have to read, is this book. As a program, like this is a book, this is one of the books that everyone who comes to my program would have to read. All right. So, but in that book, he talks about how the the education and the striving of Black Americans for education. Can someone mute themselves? And he talks about how the striving of education amongst Black Americans was a revolution. It was considered a revolution. Just the mere act of seeking education in the post enslavement period was considered a revolutionary act. Because remember, for 250 years prior to that, the law forbade Blacks from becoming educated. And the two things that Black folks did post enslavement, that they did across the board, across the South, and remember, they were the labor force for the entire country. They built churches and they built schools with their hands. The first two things that they did. So they understood the value of not only faith, but the value of education, which speaks to the 120 historically Black colleges and universities, 78 of them just 60 years after enslavement ended. So we have to really understand how this history is being buried in our discourses around education, and especially around Black people and Black communities. So, but in 1950 and 1960, you had this global revolution happening, in that you have across the global South, you have folks who are or communities and nations who are kicking out or expelling European colonizers. So across Africa, across Asia, across Latin America, across the Caribbean, you have this sense of, we need to get rid of this Eurocentric imposition on our nations. And so as this is happening across the globe, it is also similarly happening within the United States, in the sense of the civil rights movement, right? And there's a lot of converging interests around this. And there's a lot, and there are geopolitical implications in all of this too, because this is the height of the Cold War, which I won't go into that, but all of this is important to understand, right? So again, these converging interests, as I mentioned, the global South and the Cold War heat that was produced by the Black schools, right? So and what I mean by that is that, the civil rights movement and the educational aspect of the civil rights movement was a call for Black studies. And so now we're talking about the post Brown versus Board decision. So the call for Black studies, the call for Black studies meant that Black, and because we have to understand too that many Black educators didn't want to integrate Black students in into white schools. They didn't want that. They understood a lot of what we see today with the regression in Black education. A lot of them understood that in that time, and so because they had worked so hard to establish their schools and to learn how to educate Black children, many, if not most, Blacks in the South didn't want for the Brown decision to do what it did. But that's another conversation, because that it oftentimes is painted as if that the opposite was true, but it's not. And so, but the civil rights, the Brown versus Board decision, and the civil rights movement that is ushered in, and then you have like an educational aspect of it, and a lot of it is around a call for Black studies in the post Brown era. So what essentially what's happening is Black communities are saying we need a Black studies program in these universities. We need a Black studies program in these segregated schools. I mean, these integrated schools. We need this now because they understood the value of it. They lived through it and they understand how important it is moving forward. So from Black studies to ethnic studies, how did that happen? What happened? So now you have to remember, right? So the Black Power movement is happening across the South, it is simultaneously spreading across the country. How? Well, you have this migration, this great migration. You have Black Americans who are leaving the South and moving to New York City and moving to Chicago and moving to Detroit and starting communities, right? They're moving to Los Angeles, they're moving to Oakland and the Bay Area, and they're starting and forming communities. And these people are bringing a level of consciousness with them, having been part of the Black Studies movement, as we call it now, having been part of a Black Studies curriculum, right? That had instilled in them a Black pride and a Black power mentality, and they're taking this with them across the country. So, in one of the pivotal places where this happens, or where this is happening, is in San Francisco, at San Francisco State University in 1968. Well, what happened? Well, the Black Student Union is protesting for Black Studies curriculum at San Francisco State University. And this protest gets big, it gets humongous. And so, and it's starting to get national attention. Now remember, we're in the middle of the civil rights movement. We're in the middle of the anti-war movement. We're in the middle of global decolonization happening. We're in the middle of the Cold War. So all of these moving parts are happening. And the Black Student Union on San Francisco State is like, we want Black studies here. And so what happens is it gets bigger, and then they form this alliance with other student groups at San Francisco State University, such as the Asian American Student Union or student groups, um, um, Native American student groups, and the third one was the Chicano student group. So these four groups, along with the Black Student Union, formed an alliance, and this alliance was called the Third World Liberation Front. and they shut down the campus at San Francisco State University for 5 months. To this day, it is the longest student-led protest, college student protest in the history of the United States. They shut down San Francisco State University with a list of demands. Among those demands was a third world college. So they agreed on what became an ethnic studies college, the first in the country, which influenced ethnic studies programs across not just California, but across the nation, and not just the nation, but we see relics of it and semblances of it across the world, right? So you have cultural studies in different parts of the world as a result of this. You have a Black Studies program in Japan in the 1970s. So this movement had a significant impact, and it's important that we don't lose sight of the Black Power movement and the push for Black studies that's behind it all, right? So you have this ethnic studies college that is the first of its kind, and still to this day is one of the best and the brightest at San Francisco State University in 1968. All right. So this is the shift, if so to speak, from Black studies to ethnic studies. All right. So now where we are today. So California reboots this ethnic studies call, right? And so how? So, on the heels of the George Floyd murder and the protests that ensued, California passed two legislations, the Assembly Bill 1460 in 2020 and the Assembly Bill 101 in 2021. So AB 1460 was or is the Cal State University, right, which is 23 universities that services over 500,000 students. It is the largest university system in the country. And AB 1460 mandated that one of the ethnic studies courses is a requirement in order to graduate from the CSU system. One of the four being Black Studies, Chicano Studies, Asian American Studies, or Native American Studies. One of the four is a requirement for graduation, right? And then AB 101, Assembly Bill 101, mandated that ethnic studies became a requirement for high school graduation for California's public and charter high schools, which services over 2 million students. So requirement, it's a graduation requirement, right? So this is significant, especially given all of the history behind what drove and what led to ethnic studies. So, all right, remember in the beginning, I asked, what is culturally responsive education? When and why did it emerge? That was the question I asked at the outset. So, and just to sort of, rewind a little bit, right? This is over 100 years of pedagogy, of leadership, of strategizing, of understanding the environment that we live in, right? It was the practice and the understanding that many of the Black Americans left the South. It was the training that many of them who left the South and went to the East Coast or went to the West Coast or went to the Midwest. It was that background that they had with them that helped them to organize and build, in many cases, vibrant communities. We're talking about the Harlem Renaissance, and primarily, mostly, mainly African Americans, Black Americans from the South. We're talking about Bronzeville in Chicago, primarily, mainly Black Americans from the South. Detroit, the same thing, primarily Black Americans from the South. Oh, let's just talk about, since we're talking about San Francisco, let's talk about the Black Panther Party. All of the leaders came from the South. So Angela Davis, where's she from? She's from Alabama. Eldridge Cleaver, where's he from? I think Arkansas. Bobby Seale, where's he from? I think Texas. you know, on and on. Huey Newton, where was he from? He's from Louisiana, right? So we see the impact of the South across the country, right? And this is something that is laid out in Isabel. Well, she kind of lays a foundation for it. She doesn't lay it out in that sense. But Isabel Wilkerson's "The Warmth of Other Suns," she talks about the great migration of African Americans out of the South. And I expound on it in a book that I wrote in 2022, which is entitled "The Heirs of the Great Migration." I think I expound on the premise that laid by Isabel Wilkerson and a lot of what I'm speaking on as a result of this research. And so let's keep going. Okay, so Black studies, right, as we know it, right, it was an attempt to carve out a space within right in the pre-Brown era. It was an attempt to carve out a space for the entire curriculum. It was infused into the at its best in the pre-Brown era. It was how math was taught. It was how language arts was taught. It was how it was how history was taught. It wasn't just a standalone course. This right like it was from the perspective of Black Americans, like from community building and understanding economics. It was all from a Black perspective, right? So this is what Black studies meant in the pre-Brown era. In the post-Brown era, it meant something a little bit different. It was an attempt to carve out a space for to salvage what was lost during the with the advent of the Brown decision, right? And so this is essentially what we're talking about when we talk about culturally responsive education, whether it's culturally responsive school leadership, whether it's culturally responsive pedagogy, or whether it's social justice education. This is the root. This is the essence of that. So, it is the result of over 100 years of practice. Wasn't named, it was what was understood. We had to call it something in the post-Brown era. We had to give it a name because it was becoming erased and marginalized and part of this ahistorical campaign that we're all, being bombarded with today. So let's move on. So, okay, again, the name of the book is a forthcoming book. It's called, it's in the, it will be coming out in Teachers College Press, and it's called Decolonizing Education, the Birth of Ethnic Studies and the Global Struggle for Justice. And for those of you who are interested in my book, The Heirs of the Great Migration, there's a QR code here. And thank you. And if there's any questions, we will go through the Q&A session. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
That was awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Wright. So what we're going to do now, before we open up the floor for the live Q&A session, is we're going to go through kind of a structured interview with Dr. Wright. So I'll kind of kick it off with Dr. Wright. As you've explored the roots and impact of ethnic studies, what strategies do you recommend to help districts prioritize these essential courses despite ongoing challenges? I think you might be on. I'm not sure if you're speaking, but you're on.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I was on mute.
No.
So that's a really good question. And I think one of the one of the important things I would say is to leverage community partnerships. And there are a number, it just depends on where you are. Like, I find it hard pressed, wherever where you will find, you'll find community members who have a lot of this historical context, right? And so just leveraging community partnerships and finding nonprofits, um, and trying to bring in community members as guest speakers and mentors, especially if you're fortunate enough to live in areas where there are these individuals who have a lot of the information, the lived experiences of what I just spoke about. So leverage, like trying to figure out how to leverage those is important because we, a lot, in my experience, a lot of educational institutions don't do a good job of leveraging their resources. They, we our school culture is very deficit with regards to how we deal with community members from minoritized communities, even if they are, they could be doctors, medical doctors, and some of the most brilliant people, but there's this attitude that that is getting in the way. So, but leveraging community partnerships, and then there are a lot of like open educational resources, like different access journals that could be leveraged and used at relatively low cost or even free. Um, and I think like student led initiatives, right? Like, let students um, see what students bring to the conversation, right? And if they don't have anything off the top of their head, give them a project to learn something and let them bring and let them learn. And from that learning, um, let them offer, something that, could, be of use. And then, what that'll do is that'll enhance engagement among students. So, I mean, those are just some of the things that I would say.
Yeah, no, those are phenomenal answers. So we're going to move on to another question. So Dr. Wright, given that many districts face policy restrictions or budget limitations, what creative solutions might schools consider to support culturally responsive teaching?
All the answers that I just gave. Um, but also I think um so there are like professional learning networks that could be of use, and professional learning networks are, like it could be cross district um communication where you have different resources across the district. When you put them all in a space and allow them to share resources, share information, like that's a low cost way. And then a lot of the open educational resources, like a lot of them, by open it means that for the most part they're free, right? Like, so the American, like AERA has a free open access journal that has some really good research in it, and it's free. It's just like it's not, there's no paywall. And so, like finding these resources are, you know, some of what I would say.
Yeah. So, Dr. Wright, we know that your work spans international contexts. So, the question here is, what lessons from global educational struggles might inform US based districts in advancing educational equity?
One of the things um that I frustrates me, I guess, is that the best generations of Black Americans, right? The best, in my opinion, the best generations amongst them, right? This is the generation, like this maybe 30 or to 50 years after enslavement. They were very global in their mindsets. They were very much connected to the struggles across the diaspora. They were connected to what was happening in Africa with the Africans and the African struggles against colonization and colonialism. They were very connected and very much, unified in their struggle. They all understood that they had the same issue. They were dealing with this Eurocentric imposition upon their lives and their integrity and their dignity. They understood that. And so you had these networks of black and brown folks who understood that they weren't each other's enemy. And so, we've lost that, in my opinion, today. We don't have the same sense of solidarity with our brothers and our sisters from different parts of the world that are going through similar, if not identical, you know, situations as us here in the US. And so I think it's beyond time to reimagine and reopen um those avenues. That's one thing. And also you know um there are a lot of really good curriculum design models that exist in foreign, contexts. Like for example, the Maori people in New Zealand, right? Like they have a community centered approach to education that's that is very much is very good, right? And there are also places that have that provide autonomy for educators, right? Like they allow their educators to build the curriculum according to the culture and what's best suited for their schools, like and for their classrooms and their schools. And like this is unheard of in the U.S. Um, and but these models work. I mean, like as if like we're seeing in the U.S. that so much of what we're doing is not working, but we're stuck on these models of and doing things that don't work that we see clearly work in other places. And more importantly, people look at the models of this. Is the last thing I'll say. People look at the models of the Maori or the models of Finland. Finland comes up a lot, but what they don't never look at is the model of the black segregated schools. The one we have 100 years worth of evidence. This is not. This is 100 years of evidence with many people who are still alive who can tell you, right, what exactly how to do it and what to do. And we can look at the fruits of what this produced. Look at the civil rights organization. Look at the civil rights movement. Look at the civil rights era. Look at those people. They are all products of this system. These are some of the best Americans in American history, in my opinion. Right? Just in terms of what they were able to do, they created a revolution in this country and they didn't fire a shot. So that's what I'll say.
Thank you so much. I know we're nearing the end here. I really do want to thank you for this incredible presentation and answering these questions. But we do have people that are with us here live today, and I want to give everyone the opportunity to take full advantage of the EQUITYx session being able to answer live questions. So at this time, whether or not you want to raise your hand, I encourage you to drop questions in the chat for Dr. Wright if you're not comfortable coming off of mic or speaking, but really just want to hold some space for anyone on the call that wants to, give thanks to Dr. Wright for speaking today or just asking any questions, to further expound on his work. So.
Thank you so much, Dr. James, for this great talk. And inshallah, I'll be calling you this evening. We have a lot to talk about.
Of
Thank you
course.
so much for your time, man.
Thank you, Muwafiq. I appreciate it. Thanks for coming.
Of course.
Yeah, so if we don't have any further questions or nobody wants to add anything to the conversation today, again, thank you so much, Dr. Wright, for leading us through this talk today.
Someone named Noor.
Oh,
Noor has a question.
Yeah,
yeah.
sorry, I was trying to find the raise hand, but I just can't find it right now. But I really appreciate you, Dr. Wright, for sharing this today. It lays things out. I've heard bits and pieces and came across bits and pieces of this history, but it was really nice to see the entire thing threaded together. I wanted to ask you, just as we have challenges with educators, especially maybe white educators more so, leaning into this work, would you say you've encountered cases where like families of color are actually not leaning into this work for whatever reason? Is that something you would say where communities of color maybe have moved away from this work for one reason or another, or has that not been your experience or what you've researched?
That's a really good question. That's a very nuanced question because, you know, like, you know, Black is not a monolith, right? Right. And so, and then when you say communities of color, right, like it nuances the question even more because you know, folks who identify as people of color come from different places, and in many cases, if not most cases, their coming to America starts at a point that is post Brown versus Board. So they don't really understand America. They don't understand the history of the United States. They come in at a time when having, in many cases, full belief in all of the propaganda that America has, you know, sent around the world about who she is. And then they get here, and a lot of times, like, their bubbles are busted. But you know, but and so there's that. And at the same time, even at our best in terms of the fight for the fight leading up to the civil rights movement, everyone wasn't on board. You had there were people within Black communities who wished that Dr. Martin Luther King would keep his mouth shut, right? He was stabbed by a Black person, right? Like, before he died, he was, you know, so there are everyone wasn't on board, but it doesn't take everyone to be on board. It just takes the right folks. It just takes the right kinds of organizations with the right goals in mind. And so that's a short answer. And then at the same time, you know, to be fair, um, and I have to say this, like, I do have a problem with a lot of um, the so-called, many of the so-called allies, the white folks who you know, call themselves allies of this struggle. But a lot of them aren't, you know, they're not really willing to get their hands dirty, you know, and they are to a certain extent. But even those, they don't even. That's not even the whole story, because there are some who put their lives on the line, right? And and put their freedom on the line. And so we have to acknowledge those too, even though they don't represent the majority by no stretch. And they don't represent the heaviest lifting by no stretch. They don't represent the most casualties in the fight by no stretch, but they do exist. And so even to this day, they still exist, but they don't represent the majority. And I think what's important is that people, this is the last thing I'll say, what's important is that, you know, people are true to themselves. Like, whoever you are, whatever matters to you, then find a way to, you know, be true to that.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, so just want to hold space for anyone else that has any further questions. If not, we really, really appreciate you guys showing up here today. Thank you so much, Dr. Wright. For those of you guys that don't know, there are a ton of ways that you can stay connected with CRSLI. I've dropped them in the chat. So follow us on social media. Our podcast, Equity Unlocked, is on hold right now.
Candace has a question. Sorry, Jessica.
Yeah, sure.
I'm sorry, I was like double dutch. I was trying to I didn't want to talk when you were talking, Jessica, but I was trying to jump in and be like, can I ask one super quick before we close out? First of all, thank you, Dr. Wright. I am curious about where freedom schools fall in with, because I haven't done as much learning. We have them here in Minnesota in the summer, but I'm curious about when you're naming the culturally responsive school education. It wasn't named at the time. It was just how we learned. It was how that's what we did. Where does freedom schools fall in with that, or was that a part of it as well? Because I've heard that it was a counter to the quote unquote sharecropper education that many Black children were getting. I was curious if you can expand on that.
Oh, so are you referring to the that's a good question. I don't know enough of it. I don't know enough about that particular nuance to do it justice, but I do understand. I do understand the premise of your question, and I think what you're saying is, you know, along the lines of the debate between, you know, Du Bois and Booker T. Washington about the best way to educate Black folks. And to some extent, Carter G. Woodson will fall in line more with Du Bois than Booker T. Washington, right? Like loosely, we could define that those approaches to education as the freedom school. Would you say that?
Say that again, the last part.
Would you loosely define those two debates, or as the difference between the freedom schools and the schools that were primarily about, you know, the physical labor aspect?
Yes,
Right. Okay.
yes, yes.
So what I would say to that really quickly is the debate was I mean, and this is with the help of hindsight. Like, I'm in no position to say that Booker T. Washington was wrong, and I'm definitely not going to say Carter G. Wood, because I think many of us are products of the school of thought of Carter G. Woodson and W.E.B. Du Bois. But at the same time, we also know that most of us were primarily products of what Booker T. Washington was advocating, and a lot of that, and both are missing today, right? So we're missing the laborers, because remember, the one thing that's fascinating about this conversation and how we got here. This is a whole nother conversation, but just think about this for a second. Black Americans were the labor force of the United States for 250 years, the labor force, right? So now you almost barely can find labor, like a labor movement of Black folks in the United States. At the same time, we had 120 historically Black colleges and universities, almost 80 of them 60 years after enslavement ended. So this tells you the value of education that happened, you know, that we held within our communities. The real question is what happened?
Can I ask quickly, Candace, were you also referring to like modern day freedom schools, like current day?
I wasn't originally, but then I was thinking more so about the intention behind the freedom schools of old. Because I don't know enough about the freedom schools now, the ones that are here in the city I live in, to be able to speak on them. But I was thinking of the ones connected to Miss Septima Clark, and yeah, so of the old. So I probably should have did a little more homework if I asked my question, but I was just kind of trying to fit it in my brain and making sense between the way in which we learned when it was all Black schools and where freedom schools came in, if they overlapped or was it, you know, so yeah.
So this is what, and then I'm gonna wrap it up, because I know Jessica has to go, but I think I was talking to a colleague of mine and a friend of mine. We were talking recently about you know, like the incorporation of, like today, like the incorporation of what we call culturally responsive education in the entire curriculum, not just as standalone courses, but like it's infused in how you teach math, It's infused in how you teach language arts and history. It is part of those, it is part of the curriculum. And a friend of mine, actually, she's on the call, I see her blacked out, but she was graduated from Berkeley High School, and she would talked about how the Black Studies department at Berkeley was this way, and the Chicano Studies department at Berkeley was this way. They had the entire school, the entire curriculum was infused. It wasn't just these standalone courses, which reflects a lot of what the historical, the pre or the pre Brown versus Board schools look like.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, this was absolutely incredible. I really just can't put enough emphasis on how much we appreciate you, Dr. Wright, and just appreciate everyone that takes the time out of their day to come and participate in EQUITYx. We do host these monthly, so now that you guys have signed up for this, we'll definitely keep you in the loop on social and on our newsletter about more to come. If you haven't already, please do take advantage of the fact that we are giving away a free equity audit. So whether that's something that you can apply for yourself or share it with your network of educators and leaders that may benefit from something like that, we're really excited about that. And yeah, our podcast is coming back December 4th, season 2. It is hosted and narrated by the wonderful Candace Logan that's on the call here today. So if you ever hear the incredible vocals on the podcast, that's our girl there. But yeah, appreciate everyone so very much.